we have three groups, each with three and maybe one with four in it. So Susan is just dividing you into your groups right now. So you maybe want to just make a note of your instructions. In the group of four, you may have two observers. So just keep that in mind when you're actually in your group. So what I'd like you to do is, number one, agree your role for the conversation. So there will be three distinct roles. The first role is that of the observer. So your job is to open your ears, your eyes, all of your feelings, and just listen. You can take notes if it's helpful for you. The second role is that of the receiver of feedback. So you will be receiving feedback from the third role, which is the giver of feedback, the gifter of feedback. Those are your instructions. What we're going to do is give you a minute. So if you're the receiver, your job is to listen. If you are the giver, your job is to speak and provide feedback to the individual who is the listener. If you want to, I'm not going to prescribe what kind of feedback you give. I will just say be kind. And then if you're as the observer, your job is to observe. When we bring us back together in the main group, we'll ask the observers to reflect back to us what they saw, what they heard, what they noticed, what bubbled up for them. And if we have time, we might have a wider conversation. Any questions?
How many rounds are we doing? And are we just going to do one?
Just doing one. I'd love to do three, but I think being practical, we're going to do one. So 1 minute, giving feedback will bring you back in to reflect on what you have seen and heard.
You can do it. Be radically kind and candid. Think about your intention. Can you offer a gift to the person receiving feedback that may help them on their journey?
Here you go.
Indicate who in your groups were the observers. 2, 3. Awesome. Okay. So just before we move on, can you indicate silently how you found that exercise?
Like this.
Shaking heads. What? Okay. No. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So who would like to go first? So we'll hear right now just from the three observers. What did you see? What did you hear? How was it? If you can describe what you were sensing from both the listener and the receiver, that would be great. And then if we have a little bit of time, maybe we'll just open for a general discussion to get some feedback from those who were receiving and giving.
A very quick one.
Very quick one.
Yeah.
Okay. Who'd like to go first? Maddie.
No one ever wants to give feedback. So we talk about it all the time and everybody understands in theory that that's what we need to do because we don't have formal performance reviews, but nobody actually ever wants to give it. So we kind of, we seem to be stuck in that loop both, in our actual work and here. It's the same thing.
So what did you notice as the observer of the two that you were observing?
So that I think the other thing I observed is because we don't actually work together, it's difficult to come up with concrete examples of things we can give feedback about. So I think that made the exercise difficult. Okay, so in summary, so do you want to put up your hands? Who was in Madeline's? Who was the observer and who was the? So Kelvin was giving feedback and Eileen was receiving feedback and Horacio was also observing. Okay, so did you manage to at least get some feedback? Yeah, so the feedback happened, yeah. That was the other thing. People are quite keen to get feedback. So we have this mismatch. Everyone says they want feedback, but when it comes to actually giving it, nobody wants to do it. So. Thanks, Madeline. Frank, you were also observing.
Yeah, so I had Tom and Brett on my team, and since they worked in a project together, it was kind of easy for us to do this exercise. Brett was giving feedback to Tom about a project it did for between Consensus Academy and Consensus China. And so the feedback that Brett gave was very positive. he sort of demonstrated to Tom the value that he shared during his during the time they were working together, and he expressed that you know, having him on the team, he would have liked if Tom could stay on the team and work together more.
Great, thanks, Frank. Okay, Horatio, you were also observing, I think, is that correct?
I can't add much to what Madeleine said. I thought it was good the way Kelvin did it. But yeah, we don't have a lot of context together to actually give feedback. So it was also a bit of a blind shot, right?
Cool. So that was okay. Thanks, Horatio. I think maybe for the next trip we will maybe put a bit more context. It could be just within the group that you've been looking at the last 2 weeks on the course. Thank you. So we are. It's 1:05 now. We won't open this conversation to the room, but on Friday maybe we'll have a bit more time to delve into feedback. We will send you a couple of links in the meantime. There's a really good blog from the Percolab team on this particular topic, and maybe just read a bit before we get together on Friday. Could be good in this sort of conversation.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to hand over to Kate.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess.
Yeah, so just on that, I think we'll be able to do this round for everyone to receive feedback and practice giving it with a little bit more context on some things you might want to talk about. But I do want to introduce Brian Peters, who, as I mentioned, came on the pilot cohort of SO101 and is the lead, one of the team leads at Sobel. And I was just hoping, Brian, that you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the project. And our sound is bad, is that correct, Horatio? It's fine?
I heard you. I hear you very, very softly. I don't know, maybe if it's only me.
Okay, great. I'm just going to project my voice.
Yeah, it has changed a bit.
Okay. Well, we'll just go. I'll just make sure I talk loud. Brian, over to you.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me again. I really miss my SO101 session, so it's really nice to see some familiar faces and some new folks. I hope you're all enjoying the course. So I'm here in the mesh. I've been here since fall of 2017, working on the Sobel project. Yeah, so myself, Victor, and Donnie met each other and got things started here, and all three of us had a real passion for trying to figure out how tools and digital systems can support self-organizing teams, and for us, we think this is just such a beautiful challenge in the sense that digital systems notoriously can feel not so humanistic or not incent these sort of human-to-human connections, and so trying to understand how to create a more connected company and create a sandbox, if you will, for self-organizing teams and organizations across the globe to discover their practice and evolve their practice and scale it up is really what we're hoping for. And so we've been on that mission for a bit now, and really enjoying it, and have had a lot of feedback from the mesh. And now more recently have had the chance to add the voice of folks externally who were pursuing similar things and interested in digital tools to support that. So.
Cool, thanks. Any clarifying questions on that from any of you? We're going to have a lot of time at the end to ask Brian some questions, and hopefully we'll maybe workshop any of the challenges and opportunities that we've got in the mesh right now. I'm hoping in week 5 of the 4th cohort of SO101, with a focus on kind of bringing the whole South, that maybe we can, be quite open and candid, and perhaps, Susan, we could even stop recording at various points if we so choose. But to kick us off, Brian, can you tell us a bit more about your journey in or to self-management and what you've learned about yourself. Why is focusing on self-development important here?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. My journey started being a part of a more traditional organization. I was actually a consultant for passenger rail vehicle design as a mechanical engineer, working with rather large government organizations and companies across the globe. And what was wonderful about that for me is I started to discover through that work what I really cared about, which was the connections I got to make with my different clients and the customers that I got to work with, and that really fed me in those early years. But one of the challenges I sort of ran into is often I would build strong connections with the teams I was working with, only to watch that some of the practices that were employed in the work that we were doing together, the protocols, the processes, the standard business behaviors were causing harm. And at first, it was hard for me to kind of tune into that. It was even harder for me to start to understand what role I was possibly playing in that. And that was actually years later. So the journey started there, and I knew I wanted to sort of lean into some of the things I now started to understand as my personal values. But at that time, it just felt like subtle disconnects between how I was feeling and how I was showing up, and the experience around me and how well it was matching with me. And I thought that the solution was to start my own company. But later sort of discovered I just wanted to explore a different way of working. And startups and startup culture really called me. I spent 6 years working with a technology startup as it was growing from a very small team, and really growing up, and fell in love with this startup culture, people wearing lots of different hats, a lot less sort of rules and bureaucracy, and these words, flat and agile, and starting to understand what they meant, and in that context. And I started to become a manager, leading things by title. And again, a disconnect started to emerge for me. As I transitioned from being a contributor within the team to being appointed by somebody else as the leader of this engineering team, who also didn't really know me because I was relatively new to the business, and I had come from a completely different group within the business. And I started to feel a real disconnect with that role, because the team had the context, the team knew what to do, and the way that the role and the relationship was being forged implicitly between us was not the one that felt right for me. And I started to get really uncomfortable and had dialogue with a couple of my other peers who were managing, and we were growing up and starting to add more and more of these layers of management. We just started to realize that we needed to get out of the way of the teams. And I was lucky enough to meet a mentor who started to say, your job is to make yourself obsolete. And this was really exciting and really reinvigorated me. And so it became a beautiful game of helping host teams. I got really into the ideas of host leadership at around this point, and hosting teams and helping them find themselves and find their own niches, roles, leadership qualities, define the purpose, and facilitating that really invigorated me. And the idea of being able to go, yay, they're telling me I don't have a role here anymore, I've got to go find a new one, was just so exciting. One of the challenges was that this didn't scale to a certain point. And we tried some false starts doing the traditional VP leadership thing and executive team leadership, and it was miserable. And the collateral damage to the people in the business was awful. And the role I played in that was something that weighed pretty heavy on my heart, having to have dialogue unprepared and living in a system that I didn't, again, think was adhering to the values that I was starting to feel. So that's where the real sort of self-organizing journey started, reading Reinventing Organizations, looking into holacracy a little bit, talking with many other companies, and eventually starting to bootstrap a digital system to support making management obsolete. and giving teams the ability to do those jobs on their own, and trying to figure out what the digital building blocks were. It's how I met Consensus. Was around that time we were exploring other organizations that were thinking similarly. Met Joe. Unfortunately, had to wind down that startup, but serendipitously found the mesh and started Sobel. So.
Wow, fantastic! That's a really, intricate journey, I think. And you keep touching on this thing that, that was very sitting in you, like, what do I really care about here when I do my work? What are my values? Oh, I'm feeling off. You were referencing your heart a bit. And could you just draw that out a bit more and tell us a bit more about your kind of personal mission, those values, and then maybe kind of going to it. And we started this call with a check-in on some of our trigger points. What is still triggering for you, and what are you doing to work on them? And if that's one question, I can break it down.
No, that's good. I'll try to unpack it. So, I mean, some of the values, I've tried a couple of different exercises to try and name them and articulate them. And I also like to write sometimes and just see what words are repeating themselves a lot. Connection is one. These like love and connection and like heart were these words that kept repeating, and the value started to, I just realized it is this like these micro connections. Sometimes it was just like that moment, at the grocery store where we're having a chat as someone's bagging the groceries, and it gets real. And we talk about how, this person looked upset. We had a chat. I said, looks like a rough day, and immediately we're talking about some pretty deep stuff, like how she'd just gotten off the phone and her father wasn't doing well, and she's still here on this shift after her break trying to keep it together. And I just, I love that moment where we can really connect, even if it's just that small little moment when it can go deep, feels really good. And things that get in the way of that really are hard for me. And so, for example, one of the ways that I felt that value violated the most was when I had to follow a exiting protocol that was supposed to protect us legally. As a manager, I adhered to it and followed it unquestioningly, and I felt like I could never have a real conversation with the person and have a real connection in the transition to a new career or a new opportunity. And that was one of the ones that was a real trigger point in my past. So the other value that's cropping up a lot is perspective. And perspective and creativity are kind of paired together for me. I really love the creative process. And I really love being able to flip lenses and try things on from different perspectives, even ones that are uncomfortable for me and others. And when I'm in groups or teams that allow that to happen without impeding it or shaming it, that's wonderful for me. When I start to feel ashamed for a perspective I've brought forward, or that I see someone else shamed for a perspective they brought forward, I start to feel distrust, unsafe. If I'm really ungrounded, angry. So that's a big one for me, because I think it closes down that creative process, and it closes down the heart.
Great. Amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Brian. And as we've talked about a lot in this training, it's actually quite a lot of work to unlearn some of the practices and approaches to life and work that, the dominant narrative of society has taught us is the way to kind of not just survive, but to excel and to get more of what we want. So there's a big process of unlearning, and it's actually really hard. And I'm just we talked a lot in our check-in about some of the things that trigger us and what some things we personally are doing to work or be aware about why we're being triggered and to work on it. And I'm wondering if you can share anything about what's still hard for you and what are you still like triggered by?
Yeah. So, in a subtle or indirect dismissal, even whether it's perceived or real, is really hard for me. Like, if if somebody's direct with me that they don't appreciate something I'm doing or don't appreciate an approach or an opinion I'm holding, it's actually really liberating for me. I'm very comfortable in that. But sometimes people aren't comfortable giving feedback, and that's okay too. But for me, the effect it can have on me and how it can trigger me is I start to feel really unsafe. I second guess myself. I'm running narratives inside my head. That creativity and that ability to flip lenses and go on multiple perspectives can like run away. And I can start to get anxious, fumble. And really it just comes down to this like deep sense of like, they're disconnecting from me and they're not telling me why. And that connection felt so important, and it's now gone. And what did I do? And honestly, the narrative inside my head on a bad day can be quite crazy if innuendo or subtle cues are occurring and I get this blink impression, something's off, they're disconnecting and they're not telling me why.
Yeah, which can be even harder on a distributed team or organization where we are separated by the screen.
Yeah, the screen, text-based communication.
I run jokes. That's what gets me into trouble.
Our sense of humor.
So we just did a little exercise which you caught the end of around feedback. And we're trying to see this notion that feedback is a really essential part to any self-organizing system, because you need these feedback loops to improve. And often in software teams or anyone working in Agile, you have a few feedback loops brought in, just even in a little a daily stand-up or in a retrospective. But there's another practice that we need to loop in when trying to practice a more holistic self-management or self-organization, which is creating a new engagement, whatever it looks like, to give and receive feedback. And I'm wondering if you can share anything that you do. Sorry, Susan, I'm seeing a note about my audio. In your team at Snowball, or any practices you want to kind of offer around giving and receiving feedback?
Yeah, it's hard. And I think there's a lot of wonderful theory around it. And I think someone I heard when I first came in kind of mentioned that theory is one thing, and then the practice and feedback really is a practice, like practice, because each person has different things that they're good at when it comes to feedback, and blind spots and challenges when it comes to feedback. Mine's giving. As I kind of mentioned, I love feedback. And it sounds like most people have faced this challenge too, but giving unsolicited can be challenging. So in our team, some of the things that are really helpful for me and for others is creating protocols that can create deeper feedback and setting them up when things are more comfortable and peaceful and positive, and then allowing them to be there when the inevitable tensions, change, and turbulence can occur because of the complex world that we live in and startup life, etc. So some of those and what they look like are, so we do the typical agile methodologies, but we run a lot of them. So yeah, daily stand-ups, release retrospectives, weekly retrospectives, where we try to adjust the content to get a deeper feedback going. It's one of the goals. We call it out as a team. And one of the ones we found useful was actually something we learned here in SO101, which they call it the moose head. I think it was Lisa Gill's moose head. And it was the idea of creating open space where it is socially acceptable to, and the moose head was, we call it the elephant in the room, but it's basically this phrase, that's great, we did the things that are going great, we did the things that are not going so well that we want to improve, but they sounded really tactical. Where's the elephant in the room? Where's the thing that's scaring somebody that they're not talking about? That like, I am afraid, or I know this might be premature, but I've got this spidey sense. What's the elephant in the room, this thing that's not being talked about? And that is opening things up really nicely. The other thing is talking about how to give feedback. Some people are really uncomfortable, and as they're starting to practice, having a little bit of something or a framework around it can be helpful. The SBI technique, situation, behavior, impact, I found personally very helpful. It basically creates a guide for how to avoid the traditional triggers and fumbling with another person, because when you give feedback, it's vulnerable. If you genuinely care about the other person, and I think most people do when they try to give feedback, you have to be you have to approach them in a way that honors and respects what they're feeling. So one, I find asking for permission. If you haven't asked permission and you're giving unsolicited feedback, I make that mistake all the time. Recognize it immediately, say, I'm sorry, I just blurted that out. Was that okay that I shared that? Then in this SBI technique, situation, behavior, impact, trying to make sure it's really concrete. What was the situation? Let's make it vivid. It was when we were walking last Tuesday to the coffee shop and having a one-on-one chat about the project. So situation, the behavior. A couple of times you looked at your phone while we were talking, and I wasn't sure if it, I started to feel, now we're going, the situation and the behavior was you were looking at your phone. And now we're going to talk about what I feel, which is the impact, how it impacted me. I feel like maybe I was rambling. I wasn't interested in you, weren't interested in me. Can you tell me more about what was going on there? And it's about discovery, and it's about making it clear how you were emotionally feeling. So you're showing up, you're bringing that vulnerability forward, and you're not, when you follow this technique, I find it's really quite nice. It doesn't threaten the other person, because giving somebody feedback, when it's shaped in such a way, like some of the typical mistakes that can be made are like, talking on behalf of someone else, the team has really been feeling, well, you're speaking on behalf of the team. Talk about how you're feeling, or drawing conclusions about it. There's the other reason why the situation and behavior are so great. They like anchor it. This happened, this is what I noticed and how I perceived it, and this is how I felt about that. It's quite simple. That one's really been liberating for me to try and give more feedback. One last one that we just started experimenting with is sort of a, we call it the role advice process. And I've taken this one and lifted it from Edwin at Fitzy, who is also, I believe, documented in Susan's book, Reinventing Scale-Ups. And it's a wonderful one. Take a look at it. I'm not going to detail all the details here, but it removes that social stigma of going around and collecting feedback and rediscovering yourself and recrafting things for yourself in your team environment.
Yeah, and I really liked the question that you included in there, which was, can you tell me more about that? Which is not to project onto it. It's just like, let's go into this. What was going on for you in that? That's a really good tip as well. Any comments or reflections on this particular subject from anyone? We will be having time for general questions soon, but any specifically on feedback? No? Okay, well, I'll ask one last question, and then I'm going to pass it over to you, and perhaps this last question will kind of open us up a little bit more as well. So we're all in the same organization-ish, even though sometimes it seems like consensus in the mesh is many different moving parts. But Brian, I'm just interested from where, okay, and I see Horatio, you had a question. Was this on feedback? I'll come back to mine then, okay? You go ahead.
Okay. The example of the phone is a good one, but it's an easy one. Do you have any other example more involved than just checking the phone?
I do. Yeah, I've had to give some really tough feedback. I always want to be respectful of the people who I've given feedback to. So I just want to think about an example that can demonstrate going a bit deeper. Yeah. Okay. I'll go into a family scenario, just because it keeps it out of work. I recently had 2 young girls, and like all things, typically when feedback needs to come out is when change is happening, and change isn't being absorbed in a way that's working for all the parties involved. And in this particular case, the addition of granddaughters for my parents and us trying to understand our roles, how we were responding, what we were experiencing, what our wants and desires were, and how they were sometimes in conflict was really, after 2 or 3 years, getting quite out of hand, Horatio. And we weren't addressing it, and it was starting to show up in really subtle behaviors, where we would sort of expressed frustrations about something that wasn't the core issue. And so the examples would be things like being frustrated about, what somebody brought and the ingredients in it, because it wasn't supportive of my wife's dietary restrictions or my child's dietary restrictions. And we're not getting at the core issue, which was that we each had different expectations around, like, now we were able to discover that we each had different expectations around what this new chapter in our lives was going to be and what we really cared about / what we were protecting, sort of deeply at times too. We ended up having to sit down and have a chat, and we had to air out, and this is the other beautiful lesson about feedback. So this is a great question, and it will expose that, which is feedback delivered stale sucks. It absolutely sucks for all parties involved. It's the worst. Deliver it fresh, as fresh can be. Otherwise, it's just going to spill out in other ways, like it did in this story I just told. And we had to sit down and we had to relive and open up. It's like pulling open a scab and opening up all the wounds. And we had to use this sort of situation, behavior, and impact on all the things that we had been carrying with us in our sort of emotional suitcase. And we went around the table. My father did not want to participate at the front hours of this multi-hour-long dialogue. But by the end, we were all quite grateful for having done it. We had to relive a lot of different micro moments using exactly this technique, and some of them were pretty rough. So, I mean, that's an example that's not a simple phone. I hope that I've kept it kind of high level to respect the folks involved, but I hope that actually highlights that you can use the same technique on some pretty serious things, and we do.
Thanks for sharing. See you later, Madeline. Thanks
everyone.
And maybe that can just quickly, I can jump frog to my last question, which was, a lot of the work and the practices and the approaches we're using here can apply to our life. Do you think, the work of self-management, how is it applied outside of work? I mean, you've just named a good example. How important is this to you?
They're like one and the same for me. The more I've been on this journey of self-reflection in the name of work, the more I realized it was actually just self-reflection. And the more I started to develop the practice, the more or various practices, the more I realized that the way you do one thing is the way you do all things.
Can you name any of the practices or the rituals or the methods for self-reflection and interrogation that you use, if there are any concrete ones, just before we keep moving?
Yeah, so some of them started accidentally. So the most common one early on in my career was drafting an email and then asking myself whether I should send it, or recrafting it. And inevitably what I was doing was journaling, and I just didn't realize it. So that was one technique of self-reflection, was just by writing something and then reflecting on what I had written. I started to realize that was a very powerful process. The other practice that's a more recent experiment that has been incredibly fulfilling. There was a period of time where during athletics, I did endurance sports like running and cycling. And I found that time and that space to think about something for sometimes hours on end and allow the mind to wander, I realized was quite meditative. And now I recognize that's the word for it. Because the other practice that has been evolving and quite new is meditation for me. I think it's a very broad practice. Like you could say journaling is a very broad practice, right? There's lots of styles and techniques to journaling to augur in if writing is your style. But the meditation sort of, again, it can be a broad practice, and I've been exploring it and finding some things that work for me. And now sort of sitting still several times a day and closing my eyes and just seeing what happens. Sometimes using techniques like watching breathing, sometimes exploring gratitude to see where it leads me, and things I'm grateful for if I'm feeling like I need to pick me up, but other times just allowing the mind to wander and see what happens. I really get a chance to reflect, which I can't do in my busy life with the the startup, the excitement of the mesh, always on digital, 2 young kids, 2 working parents. So.
Okay, and last question from me. What's your read on self-organization, self-management at Consensus? What are the areas that we as alumni and maybe champions of this work need to pay attention to?
Okay, I think my read is that there is tons of fertile ground here. It's why I was so excited to make this the home of trying to pursue Sobel with others on the team. So that's the starting point. Incredible fertile ground, but it, much like our blockchain space, Consensus's self-organizing journey seems to be in that sort of percolating phase. And so one of the things that I'll be very candid, I keep an eye on, having been in a lot of different organizations and watching them hit transition points. I told some of my stories around it, like snap to kind of almost authoritarian, back to very sort of self-organizing practices. I watch those kinds of evolutions and curves. And so one of the things I think we need to be very cautious of is usually those moments where we snapped away from leaning into the practice or trying to pursue a more purpose-driven, self-organizing approach and being willing to hang tough into it, were those moments where things got high stakes, where the pressure started to amplify. And I would say those are also the moments where you have the greatest opportunity to really seed the practice in a meaningful way and embed it. And I think we were handed one of those opportunities in December. And so my reflection is with that, be cautious that, if this is important and this is a practice that you see value in, now is the opportunity to seed it with lasting roots. But this is also the opportunity for folks to find really compelling reasons to abandon it. It's very easy to say that, the incumbent techniques need to be used and the situation is too dire for one reason or another, or too turbulent for one reason or another. And it is very, very easy to give up at this point. I've watched it happen. And I'm passionate about actually having it be more of the positive story, that this was the opportunity, this was the moment, and we really hunkered down and decided, how are we going to govern ourselves? How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to distribute resources fairly? How are we going to give people autonomy and freedom without it turning into a country club? What is it we're going to do? And how are we going to make sure that it's built so that it's continually evolving with healthy feedback loops and practices that continue to improve it? So I mean, that's how I feel. And I get worried on some days and I get excited on others. So.
Okay. Brett, does that answer your question of how well do you think Consensus did in preserving those self-organizing values?
I think you started to touch on it, but I would love a little bit more direct kind of feedback, maybe, Brian, on how well do you think Consensus made that transition and holding onto the self-organizing values?
It's off to, it's got positive signs and it's got signs that I would want to monitor. If I want to make this really concrete, and I tend to be pretty candid about things, it makes a lot of sense to me that there was a group of individuals in December that needed to come together and form a centralized group that would help shepherd us through a pretty awkward transition. I see that as quite helpful. But what I haven't seen yet, I've seen some good signaling from Joe in his messages. I get excited about the things I see signaled in there around groups trying to figure out how to form agreements, how to adhere to those agreements. I've always seen Joe quite interested in experiments around distributing resources and distributing governance. I'm excited to see those move forward in meaningful ways and see some working groups against them. I'll get very explicit. I get worried about any transition point where centralized coordination emerges, that it has not set a mandate on how and why it's going to dissolve. It hasn't made itself accountable as to what goals it will achieve on what timelines. And that's extremely important to me because I don't like seeing transitionary governance techniques being calcified because they can calcify into a direction that takes power for themselves.
Okay, great. Thank you. Tom?
Brett, is that more candid and direct about specific situations?
That was great. Right on point.
Thank you.
Hey, Brian. I was really interested in knowing the private Sobel Advisors channel is like the most feedback. Oops, sorry, I accidentally muted myself. Is like the most. It seems like your team is able to take feedback from your users like really, really well, and not have any sort of like they're never like do it this way, or like why can't you figure this out. And I'm just wondering, like, how did you establish that culture? It's like incredible. I kind of want to know what the origin of it, because it's an asynchronous communication, right? People are like slacking in, oh, I'm having this problem, but then you look at like the customer service experience of those people, it's like really great. So how have you gotten your team or how has your team been able to take in that feedback and react to it in such a positive way?
That's an awesome question. And I'm really excited to hear that that's how it's received. So thank you for that feedback from me, Tom. We called it out really early on. So we tried to figure out for ourselves what we believed to be the key habits we needed to form in order for us to achieve our purpose. So once we'd articulated what we were trying to do as a team, we said, what are the habits we need to have? And one of the most important things to us was a recognition that although we had a guiding star of where we wanted to go, we actually had to accept the fact that we didn't know how to get there. And that the people who were going to help us understand how to get there based on our purpose was, if we said we were building this sandbox for self-organizing teams to discover their practice and that all the core ingredients would be in there and they'd be the chefs, then, if we're the grocer and they're the chefs in this analogy, then we've got to ask them about what they're trying to create. We've got to be highly focused on serving their needs and discovering them, because we didn't know where we needed to go. So we said that that's the source. The original source was what we wanted to achieve and how that was going to guide us. But we recognized that the mesh was going to be the source. And that's why we actually even renamed the channel Advisors. We don't have an advisory board like a traditional startup would. That is our advisory board. And so that mentality and infusing it and tying it directly to our success. And it also coincides with one of our core values on the team, which is an evolutionary mindset, which says that we need to sense, perceive, and respond to what's going on around us, and not think that we know what's best. And so the only way to do that is some of those types of practices. And so we encourage everyone in the team to hop into that channel and participate. Thanks, Tom, for the question. I hope that helped answer it.
Sure. Can everybody hear me on my laptop? Yeah. Good. Yeah, Brian, so you mentioned earlier this sort of concept of sort of transition. And I guess one of the reflections that I've had from working in lots of organizations that have gone through transitions a lot over the last 20 years is this concept of transition never ends. You're always in that journey of movement towards your future, and there's no real way of predicting where it's going to end, because it's as liminal, a space as life is just liminal, right? Let's be honest. And so I guess based on what you've noticed, based on what you've seen, based on where your instincts are taking you, and based on what you've observed, particularly sort of in the last 3 to 4 months, where there's been an increase of awareness around self-organization, what would you say consensus needs most right now? And what would your challenge for this group be?
Wow, that is a huge question, Mary.
I'm sorry.
No, not in a bad way, like in a wonderful, wonderful way. But like, I almost feel it would be a disservice to react and just, do my blink impression and then say it. But yeah, so I'm going to try and break that down just so that I can process it here quickly while, so
Perfect.
first thing was, totally accept. Yes, exactly. Change is constantly occurring. There's sort of micro pulses and directionalities. And then I think what I was calling out is sometimes there are shock waves, and December feels like a shock wave. There's a larger move. There's a larger phase shift. So yeah, and then I agree there. And then the question was basically, what is the one thing that we maybe need or could focus on, and then a challenge to this group. Yes? Okay. The one thing we should focus on, surrender. That there's a natural human condition, especially during situations where there's a little more tension in the mix and a little more of your own heart palpitation because you're getting triggered, your sense of security, your sense of trust is really feeling triggered. I find that what I was trying to allude to was what happens when people are uncomfortable surrendering into the unknown and accepting that unknown, accepting that change and that constant change, or accepting that phase shift occurred, or that major movement just occurred, and it doesn't mean that we need to respond with similar responsiveness immediately and abruptly. Sometimes it does, but I think sometimes surrendering into this will happen, we will have these experiences, and we will find our way, and getting uncomfortable with that uncertainty is a wonderful thing, because I think we have been taught by typical core business practices and life practices. It's a beautiful self-preserving behavior within humans to want to remove that uncertainty and add more certainty. And when you add that certainty, you add rigidity and you dehumanize the system. So watch out. Every time you think you want to add certainty, ask yourself, is it worth the price? And when you see movement afoot related, ask yourself, am I ready to surrender, or am I surrendering completely to this? So
you have just given me tingles, and I think Susan wants that. Yeah, I completely resonate with that response. But Susan, you wanted to.
Yes, and I think surrender is completely appropriate, especially to give space for those of us who tend to react quickly. However, for me, I also think that it has to do with my internal and external locus of control. And times like this help me tune into that with crystal clarity. So, for example, I cannot see or really influence strongly the entire system. So at the system level, surrender may be the best solution right now. But at the individual level, there is always something that I can do and I can take responsibility for to start to do the micro changes that is going to shift the question, that shift the system, right? So for example, one of the things that we're doing in the DNA team is just making sure that our Sobel profiles are great and up to date, and we're starting to make agreements with each other, right? Who knows what the system's going to do? But we as individuals and in our smallest unit of difference making can act even in the midst of this fundamental ambiguity.
100%. And thank you for ending that, Susan. I think that is a wonderful challenge, answering that last part of Mary's question, which was the challenge to you is exactly that. You have the ability to have way more impact than you perhaps know, and starting with small actions and small steps within yourself, within your own team, some of the most sustainable change that occurs within an organization comes through grassroots movement. And grassroots movement always starts when a small locus of individuals and teams start to model a behavior first, and then start to replicate it. Those who stand on a soapbox can very quickly get ignored. And so this is, thank you, Susan. I think that's a beautiful challenge to the team.
Yeah. Susan, name the challenge. Does anyone have, Brian, are you good for another 5 minutes? Cool. Does anyone else have a question for Brian? I think we can keep it within the self and self-organizing, or we can continue on this what's happening at consensus level. Opening it up for someone who's never asked a question before to go first. And if we don't have any, it's your time. It's the last guest session in SO101. But if not, I'll open it up to anyone else.
Girls are always really surrender.
I will surrender. Akila or Eileen or Frank. Jenny often writes questions in the chat. Brianna, yeah. Is there anything just coming up about, any of the content in this week's reader that hasn't resonated, or a challenge even, or just a curiosity about anything that Brian's sharing?
I can go. Oh, sorry. Did someone say something?
Who?
Oh.
You go, Akila.
Okay.
And then Frank.
So, I think what the perspective you gave was really interesting. Like the situation that I had last week that the other people in this call know about, I had like a situation where there was a coworker who was really difficult, and my response was like to disengage, which I don't think was the most effective response. And I really like the perspective you just gave, I think difficulties are bound to happen. So instead of like disengaging like I did, perhaps like having that expectation that like difficulties are bound to happen, like then I'll be able to better respond, like having that expectation. But that's how I understood it. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful, and we're each different, so we each have to process things differently. We need to honor and respect that. So sometimes maybe retreating at first is okay, because it gives us the time to reflect, to understand how we're feeling, but then having the courage to re-engage once you've had that time to reflect, and like you described, maybe reflecting, this is a part of this. Sometimes I'm going to be triggered. Sometimes it's going to get challenging. And if you reflect and I want to be in this team, I want to participate, and you have an opportunity to come back in, yes, that takes courage, but also honor and respect your own way of processing things. Because one of my challenges is that sometimes I don't do that. I don't retreat back. I'm very keen to engage immediately. And if I haven't grounded myself, that can actually be really problematic for myself and for the others I'm engaging with. So feel free to experiment with what's right for you, but I really like what you're describing too.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Akila. Frank.
So on the topic about surrendering, what are some ways or micro actions that you feel would be good ideas to allow surrendering to be more welcoming?
On a personal level, like, because for me, surrendering often is like a very, very personal work. It's nice to start to have dialogue as a team about how to surrender. And so one of the values I mentioned earlier about this sort of evolutionary mindset is one of the ways that our team articulates surrendering into the fact that things will change. But most of the time, the surrender is more about myself surrendering. And so in terms of the practice of surrender, it's often challenging yourself to face your fears and your triggers, and surrendering into them, where you feel that's actually sort of the best action. And so for me, sometimes surrendering control, surrendering opportunity for something to try itself and evolve, surrendering my voice is really important. I hope you can see that I enjoy communicating, I enjoy participating, I enjoy adding too much value. I enjoy saying too much. And if I'm in a team situation, I have to be really conscientious of surrendering the opportunity to share and my voice to create space for others. That's one of the things that's important. So I realized that was all over the map, and I hope that was in alignment with your question, Frank.
Okay. Perhaps we've got time for one last quick question before we check out. And Brian, you're welcome to stay for our checkout as well if you can. It will be pretty quick. Does anyone have a last kind of quick question bubbling up for them? It may just be on the tip of, it might be on the tip of your tongue. I'm sure we can. Horatio, okay, that would be our last question. Thank you.
I'm not sure if the question makes sense, but what happens if someone just doesn't engage? But by definition, there is no solution there, right? I mean, yeah?
Yeah, you must honor and respect how another person shows up. And that actually is one of the other moments where I personally have to really surrender. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's so important to me to hear the feedback, to not have it be subliminal and have my voice rattling off all the what if scenarios. And if I can't bring the other person's voice, that's actually sometimes one of the hardest things for me to surrender. Is I can start to keep going in, and I'm making it worse because I'm no longer nicely inviting them. I'm almost forcing them to try and auger in and go deep. And to your point, that's actually not a recipe for success. And it's always failed me when I try. So yeah, when somebody else is not ready, again, this is an opportunity to accept, spend more time self-reflecting, ask how you're going to show up now that that's the case. You know, if that's been discovered and it was discovered compassionately. Yes, sometimes being able to accept what is for others, where they're at in a given moment in time, where a team is at versus yourself individually. The hardest work actually is exactly that, having that honest reflection and sometimes having to make really tough decisions relative to it. I'm not comfortable here anymore, and that's okay. That's not their fault, or they're not going to share, and I think I can be okay with that. So you're right. You can't force people to do things against their will. And it's not a really good idea to try.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for all of those amazing answers, Brian. I feel like we could just keep going. And I feel like this is why one of the alumni prototypes that a bunch of people in cohort 3 started this concept of the alumni group that get together and host calls. And I just really want to help them kick that off, because we could just keep going and you could be the first kind of guest, and then other people in this cohort could be guests on that kind of thing as well. But now we're going to go into a check out. And yeah, please, it's 4 minutes, so hopefully you can stay with us, Brian. Susan, can you lead us, please?
Thanks. Surrender. It's so powerful. Sometimes in my life, I've felt like a root-bound plant. You know, when you have a potted plant and its roots just get so crushed that it stops growing. And sometimes you need to like crack the pot open and repot it so it can start growing again. And let's take that metaphor into the checkout. What's one thing that you need to surrender to make room for what can be next? Kate.
I think I need to surrender this need I have to be seen as, I don't know, like some kind of entrepreneur right at the edge of what's possible. I need to surrender that. Okay. Can I nominate?
Yeah.
Tom.
I think I need to surrender the need to try and hold different groups together. Like sometimes people need to like go do something else, right? Or they have grown and moved on in a way, or it just doesn't fit anymore, and not trying to like continue to curate that to make it work for everybody. Realize when it's not working anymore.
And nominate, I guess.
Kelvin.
So I joined Consensus 3 months ago, and part of the content team, and I need to surrender comparing my writing to what is currently being written by my own team. It's just a different tone. It's something I have to get used to and give myself time to get used to everything. Horatio.
I was tempted to say everything, but let's leave it in control.
And
Yeah. Brianna?
I think I need to surrender structure a bit more and be able to go with the flow. Yeah, and be a bit more okay with being reactive. Akila.
I think I need to surrender to, I guess also going off of what Brianna said, like uncertainty, and not having control over everything.
okay, Frank, it's your time.
I think I want to surrender my strong-headedness. I feel like I have a ton of opinions of where I can help lead my team to, but sometimes when the ball doesn't get rolling, I can get a little upset. So being patient with my team and allowing things to roll smoothly and helping my team to grow would be best for me.
Bye, Brianna. Who's next? Who hasn't gone? Jenny? And then Eileen.
I think one thing is like the need to try and do everything for myself, especially as an engineer. You can definitely get in the weeds there, and then it's just not really sustainable.
Great. Eileen.
I think I need to surrender getting everybody's approval because I will never get it. Brian?
Yeah. Oh, I'm very inspired by that one. I had a different one, but that really speaks to me too. That sometimes that seeking of connection that I always am. Sometimes I can sacrifice authenticity to create that connection. So and it really sometimes can come from a place of wanting approval from others. So thank you. I really like that one, and I resonate on that too.
Hey, Brett.
So I think something related but different is surrendering, saying yes to everything. And it's actually more powerful sometimes to say no and beneficial for everyone.
Nice. Mary?
I think I'm going to spend 2019 working on the same thing that I said I would work on in 2018, which is surrendering to the idea that I don't need to make any efforts to share my voice and what's in my head and my experience with the world, i.e. write and speak at conferences and all of the things that I'm terrified to do. That is all.
Is that everyone?
I just need to surrender.
Oh, yeah. You need to surrender. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Brian. That was a really powerful, special session.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for creating a comfortable space and some really awesome questions too.
Cool. And let's keep these conversations going in the dojo chat.
Yeah, and I'm in the mesh, so direct message me, and I love having coffee chats over Zoom. So feel free to book 15 to 30 minutes and talk about these things. I love it.
Very cool.
Awesome. Thank you. See you all on Friday. We're going to celebrate. I'm going to do a little bit more feedback. It's going to be great. Woohoo!
Like Donald Trump.
Mary.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
It's going to be great. Okay.